Amid the echoes of history, the lives of ordinary people often intertwined with the extraordinary. Though some aspects of this tale are shaped by imagination, the core storylines emerge from the annals of the past. Together, they weave a narrative that merges fact and fiction, offering a glimpse into what might have been. Chapter 1: A young patrician in the streets of Rome. Rome, 85 BCE, was alive with the hum of ambition. The city stretched beneath the midday sun, its streets busy with the constant shuffle of citizens, slaves, and merchants. The uneven cobblestones were worn from centuries of footsteps, a testament to the eternal pulse of the Republic. A cool breeze blew in from the Tiber, carrying the scent of baked bread, crushed olives, and a hint of dust. Overhead, the city's towering temples and statues cast long shadows, framing the grandeur that was Rome. A young Julius Caesar, no more than 16, made his way through the bustling streets. His tunic, made of the finest wool his family could afford, marked him as a patrician, a member of Rome's ancient aristocracy. The fabric brushed lightly against his legs with every step, swaying in time with the steady rhythm of his sandals on the stone streets. His sharp eyes flickered with curiosity, absorbing the energy of the city around him. Ahead, the Temple of Jupiter loomed on the Capitoline Hill, its majestic columns reaching toward the heavens. Caesar paused briefly, glancing up at the gleaming facade. The temple's white marble glistened in the light, but to Caesar it was more than a structure. It was a symbol of Rome's power, a silent guardian over the Republic's fate. The gods, it seemed, were always watching from their marble thrones. As Caesar walked further, he noticed the intricate arches of the aqueducts that cut across the skyline. He admired their precision, the way they delivered water to the city's fountains and baths, nourishing the heart of Rome. His family had long spoken of these marvels, proof that the Republic was destined for greatness. Yet, even at his young age, Caesar wondered if greatness could last forever. He moved toward the Forum, where voices rose in heated debate. The open square buzzed with senators, merchants, and orators, each vying for attention. Nearby, a group of men gathered under the portico of a temple, their conversation urgent. Caesar recognized one of them immediately. Cicero, the rising star of Roman oratory, only a few years his senior. Cicero's voice cut through the air, sharp and precise, as he discussed the state of the Republic with a small audience. They spoke of reform, of corruption, of the need to steer Rome away from the influence of those like Sulla, the brutal dictator who had brought Rome to the brink of chaos. Caesar lingered on the edge of the crowd, listening intently, his mind already sharp for his age, soaked in every word. The politics of Rome fascinated him, the intrigue, the power plays, the shifting alliances. It was a world his family had navigated for generations. The Julii family was ancient, tracing their lineage back to the goddess Venus herself, or so the story went. But Caesar's personal ties ran deeper into Rome's turbulent politics. His uncle, Gaius Marius, had been one of Rome's most celebrated generals, a champion of the populars, the faction that sought to empower the common people. But Marius had also been a thorn in the side of Rome's senatorial elite, and his rivalry with Sulla had plunged the Republic into civil strife. Caesar's family stood at the crossroads of these power struggles. His father, a stern man with little affection to spare, had recently died, leaving Caesar to navigate the complexities of Roman politics on his own. Yet Caesar was not entirely alone. His marriage to Cornelia, the daughter of Lucius Cornelius Cinna, had further tied him to the populares' cause. Cinna, like Marius, was a staunch opponent of Sulla and his regime. This marriage had been arranged with politics in mind, as was the custom among Rome's elite. Caesar had little choice in the matter, but he saw the opportunity it presented. His future would be shaped by these alliances, and Caesar, even now, was beginning to sense the path that lay before him. As he walked, Caesar's thoughts wandered to his education. His tutors had instilled in him the discipline of rhetoric, history, and philosophy. Greek culture, with its wisdom and elegance, was an ever-present influence. The works of Homer and the speeches of Demosthenes filled his mind, teaching him not only how to speak, but how to think. But it was not just the lessons from books that shaped him. His family, with its web of connections, enemies, and allies, provided the real education. Marius, now gone, was a looming figure in his memory, a man whose career had shown the heights and dangers of Roman ambition. His father-in-law, Cinna, though not as famous, was just as determined in his own way. These men and their choices would shape the boy into the man he would become. As Caesar approached the forum, he glanced once more at the senators debating in the distance. The grandeur of the Republic surrounded him, but beneath the surface he could sense the fractures. Even at this young age, he knew that Rome was at a turning point. He was determined somehow to play a role in what was to come. For now, though, he remained a young patrician, walking through the streets of Rome, listening, observing, learning. The shadows lengthened as the sun began its slow descent. The city's hum continued, unaffected by the passage of time. The future, however, was already taking shape, and Julius Caesar would soon find himself at its center. Chapter 2: Ambition Takes Root, Early Military Career. The distant shores of Asia Minor stretched out before Caesar, a rugged landscape of mountains and sea, where the ancient cities of the Greek world clung to the coastline. It was here, in this foreign land, that a young Julius Caesar found himself in the early years of his military career, far from the streets of Rome. The air was thick with the smell of salt water and pine, and the distant cries of seagulls filled the sky. The sun blazed down on the rocky hills, casting a shimmering heat over the land as Caesar, in his early 20s, prepared for the siege of Mytilene. Asia Minor had been a battlefield for Rome's ambitions, a place where generals sought glory and the Republic extended its influence. Caesar's arrival was not one of grandeur or prestige. He was still relatively unknown, a young man seeking to make his mark in the world. But it was here, on these battlefields, that his ambition began to take root. The siege of Mytilene was a grueling affair, as the Roman legions clashed against the stubborn resistance of the city's defenders. Caesar, a mere officer at this point, distinguished himself through acts of daring that caught the attention of his superiors. It was said that during one assault, when the Roman lines faltered under the onslaught of Mytilene's arrows and stones, Caesar rallied a small group of soldiers and led them into the fray. With sword in hand and the Roman standard flying beside him, he charged the enemy, cutting through their ranks with an audacity that defied his youth. His bravery was not without notice. Word of his deeds spread through the camp, and soon his name was being whispered by the soldiers and officers alike. He was awarded the civic crown, a rare honor given to those who had saved the lives of fellow citizens in battle. For Caesar, it was not merely a symbol of recognition, but a sign that his path to greatness had begun. Yet it was not the siege that would cement Caesar's early reputation. It was a strange and dangerous episode that occurred shortly after, the incident with the pirates. The waters of the Aegean Sea between Greece and Asia Minor were infamous for piracy. Roman merchants and ships often fell prey to bands of marauders who lurked among the islands. While traveling to Rhodes to study rhetoric, Caesar's ship was attacked, and he was taken hostage by a group of Cilician pirates. They were a rough and wild bunch, accustomed to holding noblemen for ransom, and to them, Caesar was just another prize. But Caesar's response was far from ordinary. The pirates demanded a ransom of 20 talents of silver for his release, a sum that would have been significant for most. Caesar, however, laughed in their faces. 20 talents, he told them, was an insult to his status. He insisted they raise the ransom to 50 talents, and the astonished pirates, both amused and perplexed, agreed to the terms. While waiting for the ransom to be delivered, Caesar lived among the pirates for nearly 40 days. But he was not their prisoner in the traditional sense. Instead, he acted as if he were their commander. He gave them orders, berated them for their lack of discipline, and even recited poetry and speeches, demanding their attention as if they were his audience. The pirates, entertained by his boldness, humored him, unaware of the fate that awaited them. When the ransom was finally paid and Caesar was freed, he wasted no time in seeking vengeance. He quickly assembled a small fleet from the nearest Roman outpost and set sail back to the pirates' stronghold. With swift and brutal efficiency, he captured them, reclaiming the silver they had taken and seizing their spoils. True to his promise, Caesar had the pirates crucified, though he reportedly offered them the mercy of a quick death by ordering their throats to be slit first. This ruthless episode marked the beginning of Caesar's legend, a man of boundless confidence who commanded not only respect but fear. The incident with the pirates was more than a tale of retribution. It was a demonstration of his ability to turn any situation to his advantage, to manipulate events and people to suit his ambitions. Caesar returned to Rome with a newfound reputation. His military service in Asia Minor had earned him honors, and his dealings with the pirates had spread tales of his audacity throughout the Mediterranean. Yet, it was clear to those who observed him closely that this was just the beginning. The young officer, once held hostage by bandits, had emerged as a man to be reckoned with, one whose ambition had no limits. As he stood on the deck of the ship that carried him back to Rome, the wind ruffling his hair and the distant silhouette of the city's hills coming into view, Caesar's mind was already turning to what lay ahead. He was not content with the laurels of a soldier or the accolades of a nobleman. His vision reached further, to the very heart of power in the Republic. The future, he knew, belonged to those who seized it, and Julius Caesar was prepared to seize it all. Chapter 3. The Path to Power, Politics in a Tumultuous Rome. Rome in the 70s BCE was a city of contradictions. Its marble temples and grand public spaces projected an image of stability and order, but beneath this facade, the Republic trembled with discontent. Corruption was rife, the power of the Senate eroded by internal strife, and the streets thrummed with the murmurs of the common people, their grievances growing louder each day. Into this volatile landscape stepped Julius Caesar, returning from his military campaigns in the East, a man with a reputation for daring and an ambition that was becoming impossible to ignore. Caesar was no longer the unknown young patrician wandering the streets. His military exploits had earned him accolades, but it was in the political arena that he now sought to make his mark. He was a man of action, and Rome, embroiled in social and political chaos, was the perfect stage for his talents. The Forum, the heart of Roman public life, became his battleground. Here, amidst the bustling crowds of citizens, politicians, and merchants, Caesar's voice began to rise above the din. He quickly earned a reputation as a brilliant orator, his speeches delivered with a fiery passion that captivated the masses. His words were carefully crafted to appeal to the common people, the populares, who had long been neglected by the ruling class. Caesar spoke of reform, of justice, of the need to curb the power of the Senate and return authority to the people. It was a message that resonated deeply with the growing frustrations of the lower classes, and his popularity soared. But Caesar was not merely content to stir the emotions of the crowd. He understood the intricacies of Roman law and used his skills as an advocate to defend those who had been wronged by the system. He took on high-profile cases, challenging corrupt officials and exposing their misdeeds. Each victory in the courts was a blow to the Senate's authority, and each loss was a lesson in navigating the complexities of Roman politics. Caesar was building a reputation not just as a speaker, but as a man of action, someone who could deliver on his promises. It was during this time that Caesar began to recognize the importance of alliances. Rome's political landscape was fragmented, and power rested not just in individuals, but in the factions and coalitions they could command. Two men in particular stood out: Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, and Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, known to history simply as Pompey, a celebrated general who had recently returned to Rome after a string of military successes in the East. Crassus, whose vast fortune gave him enormous influence, had long harbored political ambitions, but lacked the personal charisma to dominate Rome's political scene. Pompey, on the other hand, had the popularity of a war hero, but struggled to gain the trust of the Senate, who saw him as an upstart threat to their authority. Caesar, with his growing popularity among the people and his keen political instincts, saw an opportunity. The three men formed an unofficial alliance, which would later become known as the First Triumvirate. Each brought something to the table: Crassus with his wealth, Pompey with his military clout, and Caesar with the voice of the people behind him. Together, they would bend the Republic to their will, though the seeds of rivalry and betrayal were sown even in this moment of cooperation. In the midst of these machinations, Caesar continued to solidify his standing with the public. His strategy was clear: the people were his greatest asset, and he would use every means at his disposal to win their loyalty. Caesar sponsored extravagant games and public festivals, events that dazzled the masses and kept his name on their lips. Chariot races, gladiatorial contests, and theatrical performances were held at his expense, each grander than the last. These spectacles were not mere entertainment. They were carefully calculated displays of generosity designed to ensure the people's unwavering support. As Caesar's influence grew, so too did the unease among the Senate. The aristocratic families that had long dominated Roman politics viewed him with suspicion. His populist rhetoric and open defiance of the Senate's authority were dangerous, threatening the established order. Many senators saw him as a demagogue, a man willing to upend the Republic in his quest for power. But for the time being, they were powerless to stop him. His alliance with Crassus and Pompey, combined with his popularity with the masses, made Caesar too formidable a force to confront directly. Yet beneath the surface, tensions simmered. The Senate was not without its allies, and powerful figures like Cato and Cicero sought to counter Caesar's influence wherever they could. Cicero, the brilliant orator and staunch defender of the Republic, saw in Caesar the potential for tyranny. His speeches in the Senate grew increasingly pointed, warning of the dangers posed by men who placed themselves above the law. But even Cicero's words could not diminish the fervor with which the people embraced Caesar. Caesar, ever the opportunist, understood that his rise was not without its risks. The balance of power in Rome was delicate, and any misstep could lead to his downfall. But for now, he remained undeterred. His ambition burned brighter with each passing year, and the path to power, though fraught with peril, was one he intended to follow to its ultimate end. By 65 BCE, Caesar had secured the position of aedile, a magistrate responsible for public works and games. It was a role that allowed him to continue his lavish public entertainments, further endearing him to the people. He spent enormous sums, much of it borrowed from Crassus, to ensure that his games were the most spectacular Rome had ever seen. His debts piled up, but Caesar was not concerned. To him, debt was merely a tool, a means to an end. As long as the people cheered his name, the future remained his to shape. Rome, restless and uneasy, continued to shift beneath the weight of its own contradictions. The Senate's authority weakened, the people clamored for change, and the streets buzzed with rumors of revolution. At the center of it all stood Julius Caesar, a man whose ambition knew no bounds, whose alliances were as tenuous as they were powerful, and whose path to ultimate power was only just beginning. Chapter 4: Gaul and Glory, Conquests in the West. The rolling hills of Gaul stretched endlessly into the distance, a vast and untamed land where thick forests blanketed the horizon and rivers carved through the valleys. It was a land of fierce tribes and fractured alliances, a place that seemed to resist Rome's civilizing touch. But to Julius Caesar, Gaul represented opportunity, both for personal glory and for the expansion of the Republic's borders. It was here, on the farthest edge of the Roman world, that Caesar would carve his name into history through a decade of relentless conquest. In 58 BCE, when Caesar was appointed governor of Cisalpine Gaul, He inherited not only the region, but also the command of several legions stationed there. His political ambitions in Rome had driven him to this point, and now, with Gaul at his feet, Caesar saw the chance to achieve something far greater than mere political office. He was determined to bring all of Gaul under Roman control, a feat that would not only extend the Republic's boundaries, but also secure his place as one of its greatest generals. The tribes of Gaul were no easy opponents. They were skilled warriors, hardened by years of internal conflict and resistance to foreign invaders. Yet they were divided, and Caesar knew how to exploit this weakness. His strategy was one of divide and conquer, turning tribes against one another, making alliances where it suited him, and crushing those who defied Rome's authority. His legions, disciplined and fiercely loyal, followed him with unwavering devotion as he led them into battle after battle. One of Caesar's early victories came against the Helvetii, a migrating tribe that sought to settle in Roman territory. Caesar's forces met them near the Saône River, where he caught them off guard, delivering a devastating blow. The battle was bloody and relentless, with the Roman legions pressing forward in tight formations, their shields locked as they advanced like a human wall. The Helvetii, though brave, could not withstand the Roman onslaught, and by the end of the battle, tens of thousands lay dead. Caesar's victory was total, and it sent a clear message to the rest of Gaul: resistance would be met with merciless force. But the conquest of Gaul was far from over. In the years that followed, Caesar faced a series of uprisings and rebellions, each more desperate than the last. The most formidable of these came in 52 BCE, led by the chieftain Vercingetorix of the Arverni tribe. Vercingetorix was a charismatic leader who managed to unite the fractured Gallic tribes in a final bid to repel the Roman invaders. He used guerrilla tactics, harassing Caesar's forces and burning fields to deny them supplies. But Caesar, ever the master strategist, adapted quickly. The decisive moment came at the siege of Alesia, where Vercingetorix and his army took refuge within a fortified hilltop city. Caesar's response was both brilliant and brutal. Instead of assaulting the stronghold directly, he ordered the construction of massive fortifications around the city, trapping Vercingetorix and his forces inside. It was a siege within a siege, as Caesar's men built walls, trenches, and towers, cutting off any hope of escape or reinforcements. For weeks, the Gauls held out, hoping for relief from a massive Gallic army gathering to the north. But Caesar was prepared. As the relieving force approached, Caesar ordered the construction of a second set of fortifications facing outward, creating a double ring around Alesia. The ensuing battle was fierce and chaotic, with the Gauls launching desperate attacks from both inside and outside the walls. Caesar, ever present on the battlefield, personally led his men in repelling the attacks, his red cloak billowing in the wind as a rallying point for the legions. In the end, the Gallic relief force was crushed, and Vercingetorix, realizing that further resistance was futile, surrendered to Caesar. The sight of the defeated chieftain, clad in his armor and kneeling before the Roman general, was a moment that would be immortalized in Roman history. Caesar's victory at Alesia effectively ended organized resistance in Gaul and solidified his reputation as a military genius. He had achieved what many thought impossible. He had conquered all of Gaul. But the cost of Caesar's triumphs was immense. The Gallic Wars were marked by extreme brutality. Entire villages were wiped out, populations enslaved or massacred as a warning to others. By the end of his campaigns, it was estimated that 1 million Gauls had been killed and another million enslaved. To Caesar, this was the price of empire. To the Senate, however, it was a chilling demonstration of his power. As word of his victories spread, Caesar's fame grew to legendary proportions. His soldiers adored him, for he shared in their hardships, marching alongside them, enduring the same hunger and cold. He rewarded their loyalty with spoils and promotions, creating a bond between general and army that went beyond mere duty. To the men of the legions, Caesar was not just a commander, he was a leader who would never abandon them. Back in Rome, however, Caesar's growing power was becoming a cause for concern. The Senate, already wary of his populist tendencies, saw his conquests in Gaul as both a triumph and a threat. Chief among those who began to fear Caesar's influence was Pompey, once his ally but now increasingly suspicious of Caesar's ambitions. Pompey, who had once been the darling of the Republic, now found himself overshadowed by Caesar's military accomplishments. The alliance between them, once strong, began to fray. The Senate's unease was palpable. Caesar's legions were loyal to him personally, not to the state, and his victories had made him incredibly wealthy and powerful. Rumors swirled that Caesar, flush with the spoils of Gaul, might not return to Rome as a humble citizen, but as a conqueror, eager to seize power for himself. The very fabric of the Republic, already strained by years of political infighting, was now stretched to its breaking point. As Caesar continued his campaigns, pushing the boundaries of Rome to the English Channel and the Rhine River, the Senate issued increasingly urgent demands for him to return to Rome and relinquish his command. But Caesar, ever calculating, knew that returning without his legions would leave him vulnerable to his enemies. He had no intention of becoming a victim of the Senate's intrigues. Instead, he prepared for the next stage of his journey, a return to Rome that would ignite the flames of civil war. Chapter 5: The Rubicon and Civil War. The Rubicon River, winding through the rugged hills of northern Italy, was not wide nor particularly deep. Its waters ran clear and cold, cutting a quiet path through the countryside. But on a fateful day in January of 49 BCE, the Rubicon became more than just a stream. It became the line that separated Julius Caesar from the fate of the Roman Republic, a boundary that once crossed would plunge Rome into civil war. Caesar stood at its banks, his cloak pulled tightly around him against the winter chill, his mind racing with the gravity of the decision before him. He paused for a moment, the silence thick in the air, then spoke the words that would change history. Alea iacta est, the die is cast. With that declaration, Caesar led his legions across the Rubicon, an act of open defiance against the Senate. It was a point of no return, a bold stroke that signaled his intent to seize power by force if necessary. Rome had faced internal strife before, but this was different. Caesar was not merely challenging political rivals. He was challenging the entire structure of the Republic. To many, it was an act of treason. To Caesar, it was the only way forward. The origins of the conflict lay in the Senate's growing fear of Caesar's power. His decade-long conquest of Gaul had made him a war hero, adored by the people and fiercely loyal to his soldiers. But it had also made him a threat. Pompey, once Caesar's ally and fellow member of the First Triumvirate, had grown increasingly wary of Caesar's rising influence. The Senate, with Pompey now at its head, demanded that Caesar disband his legions and return to Rome as a private citizen. To do so would have meant political and perhaps even physical ruin for Caesar, who knew that his enemies in the Senate would waste no time in prosecuting or eliminating him. And so, Caesar chose war. As Caesar's forces marched south from the Rubicon, they moved swiftly and with purpose. His legions, hardened by years of campaigning in Gaul, were battle-ready and fiercely loyal to their commander. By contrast, Pompey, though in command of Rome's official armies, found himself scrambling to gather forces in the face of Caesar's bold advance. Pompey had believed that a show of force would be enough to deter Caesar, but he had underestimated his rival's resolve. In the early days of the Civil War, Pompey and the Senate fled Rome, unwilling to face Caesar's legions head-on. Caesar, with his usual strategic brilliance, chose not to linger in the capital. Instead, he focused on cutting off Pompey's lines of support, marching his army through Italy with astonishing speed and efficiency. City after city opened its gates to Caesar, their populations often welcoming him as a liberator rather than a conqueror. The decisive battle, however, would not take place on Italian soil. By the summer of 48 BCE, Pompey had gathered a massive army in Greece, comprised of Roman legions and allied forces. Caesar, though outnumbered, pursued him across the Adriatic Sea, determined to bring the conflict to an end. The two armies finally met at Pharsalus, a wide plain in central Greece, where one of the most famous battles in Roman history would unfold. The morning of the battle was hot and dry, the sun beating down on the dusty plain as both armies formed their lines. Pompey's forces vastly outnumbered Caesar's, by some accounts nearly twice the size. His infantry stretched out in a long, solid line with cavalry positioned on the flanks, poised to encircle Caesar's smaller army. But Caesar, ever the tactician, had a plan. He knew that Pompey's forces, while numerous, lacked the cohesion and discipline of his veteran legions. Caesar positioned his troops in a compact formation, the center reinforced by his most experienced legions. To counter Pompey's overwhelming cavalry, he ordered his men to build a secondary line of soldiers behind the main force, hidden from view. As Pompey's cavalry charged, expecting to flank Caesar's men, they were met by this surprise second line, whose spears and shields held firm. The cavalry faltered, confused and disorganized, and Caesar's legions pressed the attack. The battle raged for hours, the clash of swords and the cries of dying men filling the air. Caesar, calm and composed, directed his forces from the front, his presence inspiring his soldiers to fight with unmatched ferocity. Slowly but surely, Pompey's army began to crumble under the relentless pressure. Caesar's legions advanced, pushing deeper into the enemy's ranks, and by the end of the day, Pompey's forces were in full retreat. The victory at Pharsalus was complete. Pompey, once the most powerful man in Rome, fled the battlefield, his army shattered. Caesar, ever calculating, showed mercy to the surviving soldiers, offering them a place in his own ranks rather than slaughtering them. His magnanimity was not just an act of kindness, it was a political move, designed to consolidate his power and win over those who had once fought against him. Pompey's flight led him to Egypt, where he sought refuge, but he would find only betrayal. The young pharaoh Ptolemy XIII, eager to gain favor with Caesar, had Pompey murdered as soon as he arrived. When Caesar learned of Pompey's death, he reportedly wept, whether out of genuine grief for his former ally or for the loss of a worthy rival, history does not make clear. But with Pompey gone, the civil war was effectively over. Caesar was the undisputed victor. Caesar returned to Rome not as a general but as a conqueror. His entry into the city was a moment of unparalleled triumph. The streets were lined with cheering crowds, hailing him as the savior of the Republic. Though in truth, the Republic as it had been was no more. Caesar, now in control of the Roman state, assumed the role of dictator, a position that had been used sparingly in times of crisis, but was now wielded indefinitely. His power was absolute. The Senate, once the heart of Roman governance, was reduced to a mere advisory body, its members cowed into submission. Caesar, ever aware of the need to maintain a facade of republicanism, allowed the Senate to continue its functions, but it was clear to all that Rome now belonged to him. His reforms, sweeping and ambitious, began to reshape the city and its empire. But beneath the surface, there were rumblings of dissent. Caesar's victory had come at a price, and even as he stood at the pinnacle of his power, the seeds of his eventual downfall were being sown. For now, though, Julius Caesar was master of Rome, his conquest complete, his ambition realized. The die had indeed been cast, and the world would never be the same. Chapter 6. Dictator Perpetuo, Caesar's Rule. By 45 BCE, Julius Caesar stood as the undisputed master of Rome. The civil wars had ended, his enemies either dead or in exile, and the Republic lay at his feet. But what had once been a fragile political system, reliant on balance and the will of the Senate, was now transformed into a vessel for Caesar's ambition. The title of Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life, was bestowed upon him by a Senate that had been reduced to a shadow of its former self. This title, unprecedented and powerful, confirmed what many already knew. Caesar was not merely the first among equals, he was Rome itself. Caesar's rule was marked by a whirlwind of reforms, each designed to stabilize the state and cement his legacy. He knew that his position, while strong, was fragile. The Roman people, especially the lower classes, loved him for his military victories and generosity. Yet, behind the veneer of popular support, there were cracks in the foundation of his power. The Senate, once a bastion of republican authority, feared and loathed Caesar. They saw him as the man who had destroyed the very institutions that had governed Rome for centuries. But to Caesar, the old ways were relics, standing in the way of his vision for a new and more powerful Rome. Among his most significant reforms was the introduction of the Julian calendar, a radical shift from the chaotic lunar system that had left Roman timekeeping in disarray. With the help of Greek astronomers, Caesar implemented a calendar that synchronized with the solar year, establishing 365 days with a leap year every fourth year. It was a move as pragmatic as it was symbolic, aligning Rome with the cosmic order and further reinforcing Caesar's vision of a Rome governed by rationality and efficiency. But the calendar was just the beginning. Caesar sought to alleviate the crushing burden of debt that weighed heavily on the Roman populace. His debt relief measures, while controversial among the wealthy elite, earned him the enduring loyalty of the lower classes. Many Roman citizens, suffocated by usurious loans and predatory lenders, saw Caesar as their savior. He introduced laws that reduced the interest on debts and protected borrowers from being forced into slavery due to unpaid loans. These acts were not just financial reforms, they were political moves, calculated to solidify his position as a champion of the people. Caesar also expanded the Senate, filling its ranks with his loyal supporters and men from the provinces. This expansion was unprecedented, diluting the power of the old aristocracy and bringing in fresh faces, many of them from Gaul and other newly conquered territories. To the traditional Roman elite, this was an affront, a dilution of their ancient privileges. But to Caesar, it was a necessary step in consolidating his authority and ensuring that the Senate reflected the new Rome he envisioned, an empire that stretched beyond the city's walls to the farthest reaches of the known world. One of the most intriguing aspects of Caesar's rule was his relationship with Cleopatra, the enigmatic Queen of Egypt. Their affair had begun years earlier, during Caesar's time in Egypt following Pompey's death, and had since evolved into a partnership that captivated the imagination of both Rome and the wider Mediterranean world. Cleopatra, with her intelligence and charisma, was more than just a lover to Caesar. She was a political ally. Their union produced a son, Caesarion, and though Caesar never officially recognized the child as his heir, rumors of their relationship spread like wildfire through Rome. To the people, Cleopatra represented exotic luxury and the allure of the East. But to the Senate and many of Rome's elites, she symbolized something far more dangerous: Caesar's willingness to place his personal desires above the interests of the Republic. His decision to bring Cleopatra to Rome in 46 BCE, where she lived in a villa on the outskirts of the city, only fueled speculation that Caesar had imperial ambitions beyond even his dictatorial powers. Whispers circulated that he might marry Cleopatra and rule jointly as king and queen, a notion that horrified the staunch defenders of Rome's republican tradition. Caesar's belief in his divine right to rule only heightened these fears. He claimed descent from the goddess Venus through his family line, and as his power grew, so too did his self-assurance. Statues of Caesar appeared across the city, not merely as representations of a political leader, but as images that placed him alongside the gods of Rome. Coins were minted bearing his likeness, a privilege usually reserved for deities or long-dead heroes. The Senate, increasingly sidelined, watched with growing unease as Caesar's image became omnipresent, his name invoked with reverence among the people. In 44 BCE, Caesar took a bold step further, accepting the title Dictator Perpetuo. To many, this was a sign that he intended to rule not as a temporary crisis manager, but as a monarch in all but name. Rome, which had overthrown its kings centuries earlier, now faced the prospect of a single ruler with absolute power. Yet, despite his overwhelming authority, Caesar maintained a delicate balance. carefully portraying his reforms as necessary for the stability of the state. He pardoned many of his former enemies, promoting a narrative of clemency and reconciliation. But as Caesar's power reached its zenith, so too did the paranoia within the Senate. Men who had once served him loyally now began to fear what his reign would mean for the future of Rome. The idea that Caesar would crown himself king, a title that had been anathema to Romans since the fall of their last monarch, Tarquin the Proud, was unbearable to many. Even though Caesar publicly refused the crown when it was offered to him during the Lupercalia festival, his ambition seemed undeniable. As Caesar continued to reshape Rome, he moved with the confidence of a man who believed he was destined for greatness. His reforms touched every aspect of Roman life, from governance to infrastructure to culture itself. He launched projects to build new temples, forums, and theaters, leaving a physical legacy that would outlast him. Yet, despite the veneer of calm, there were murmurings of discontent among the Senate, whispered plots against him that grew louder with each passing day. The Roman elite had grown accustomed to the idea of a republic ruled by many, not one. And though Caesar promised stability and prosperity, his ascent to near-divine status made them uneasy. As he stood atop the political and social order, they saw in him not a restorer of the republic, but its destroyer. The fear of what Caesar might do next began to crystallize into action. In secret, senators who had once supported him began to conspire against him. They were convinced that the republic could only survive if Caesar were removed, and they whispered plans of assassination, the details yet to be determined. The future hung in the balance, and Caesar, in his final months, seemed unaware of the danger lurking around him. Or perhaps, with the confidence of a man who believed in his own destiny, he simply did not care. For now, Caesar ruled as dictator perpetuo, his reforms reshaping the republic into an empire in all but name. The people adored him, the Senate feared him, and Rome, ever-shifting, ever-changing, stood on the precipice of something entirely new. Chapter 7. The Ides of March. Assassination Plot. The early months of 44 BCE in Rome were marked by an uneasy quiet, a deceptive calm that veiled the growing storm. Caesar, now dictator perpetuo, was at the height of his power. The city bustled as always, merchants peddling their wares in the crowded streets, senators and magistrates going about their duties in the forum. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, whispers of treachery began to spread. In the shadowed corners of Rome's grand buildings, Caesar's enemies gathered, plotting the downfall of the man who had come to dominate every aspect of the Republic. Among the conspirators, no names resonated more than Marcus Junius Brutus, Gaius Cassius Longinus, and Decimus Junius Brutus Albinus. Each of them had a complex and intimate history with Caesar, and each played a crucial role in the conspiracy that would culminate on the Ides of March. Brutus, the most famous of the conspirators, was perhaps the most conflicted of them all. A man of impeccable lineage, Brutus traced his ancestry back to the founder of the Republic, Lucius Junius Brutus, who had driven out Rome's last king. This legacy weighed heavily on Brutus, who had long been regarded as a paragon of republican virtue. Caesar, however, was more than just a political figure to Brutus. He had been a father figure, a mentor, and even, according to some, his biological father. The bond between them was deep, but as Caesar's power grew, so too did Brutus's sense of unease. For all his affection for Caesar, Brutus was haunted by the fear that the Republic was slipping into monarchy. And when whispers began that Caesar might declare himself king, Brutus faced an agonizing decision: to betray the man who had shaped his life, or to betray the Republic itself. Cassius, by contrast, harbored no such inner conflict. A military man and a seasoned politician, Cassius had long resented Caesar's dominance. He had fought under Pompey in the Civil War, and though he had accepted Caesar's clemency after Pompey's defeat, his heart remained with the cause of the old Republic. Where Brutus hesitated, Cassius acted. He became the architect of the conspiracy, recruiting senators and former allies of Pompey, who shared his disdain for Caesar's authoritarian rule. Cassius appealed to their sense of duty, warning that if they did not act soon, Rome would once again have a king, and the Republic would be lost forever. Decimus, the third key figure, was perhaps the most surprising of the conspirators. Like Brutus, Decimus had been one of Caesar's most trusted men, serving as a general in his campaigns in Gaul and as a close advisor in the years that followed. Caesar thought of him as a loyal friend, and Decimus had been honored with great responsibility in the new regime. But beneath his outward loyalty, Decimus harbored ambitions of his own. He resented the idea of being subordinate to a single ruler, and though his relationship with Caesar had been built on years of trust, he allowed himself to be swayed by Cassius's arguments. Decimus' involvement would prove critical. He had the access, and he knew how to exploit Caesar's trust. The plot came together slowly but surely as more senators, fearful of Caesar's growing power, joined the conspiracy. They met in secret, often under the cover of darkness, in private homes or secluded gardens, their voices low, their faces grim. Some hesitated, their consciences uneasy at the thought of spilling the blood of the man who had saved the Republic from chaos. But the fear of monarchy, of a Rome ruled by one man, drove them forward. They convinced themselves that Caesar's assassination was not murder, but an act of preservation. Preservation of the ideals of liberty, of the Republic itself. As the Ides of March approached, the tension in Rome grew palpable. Caesar, unaware of the precise nature of the plot, but ever mindful of the dangers that surrounded him, had received several warnings. His wife, Calpurnia, had been troubled by ominous dreams in which she saw Caesar's blood flowing through the streets. His friends, too, had urged him to be cautious, but Caesar, ever the pragmatist, dismissed these warnings as the superstitions of a troubled mind. He was, after all, the most powerful man in Rome. Who would dare strike against him? On the morning of March 15, 44 BCE, Caesar awoke to an uneasy sky, the air heavy with foreboding. Calpurnia begged him to stay home, to avoid the Senate meeting that day. Caesar, moved by her pleas, briefly considered postponing his appearance, but Decimus arrived at the villa, convincing him otherwise. Decimus, in his usual calm demeanor, reassured Caesar that the Senate needed him, that staying away would only sow fear and uncertainty. Trusting his friend, Caesar relented. As Caesar made his way to the Senate house, the streets of Rome seemed to close in around him. He walked with his usual confidence, his red cloak billowing behind him, flanked by his attendants. The senators who passed him bowed with respect, but their faces betrayed no emotion. The Senate house itself loomed ahead, the scene of so many of Rome's greatest debates, but today it would bear witness to something far more dramatic. Inside, the conspirators had already gathered, each one taking their place as if the day would proceed as usual. Cassius and Brutus exchanged glances, their hearts pounding with anticipation. Decimus, playing his role to perfection, greeted Caesar warmly as he entered the hall, guiding him to his seat. Caesar, ever the politician, acknowledged the senators with a nod, unaware of the daggers hidden beneath their robes. The attack came swiftly, catching Caesar off guard. As he sat, one of the conspirators stepped forward and, without warning, plunged his dagger into Caesar's side. For a moment, there was only silence, an eerie pause as Caesar recoiled in shock. But then the Senate house erupted in chaos. The other conspirators rushed forward, their daggers flashing in the dim light as they stabbed at Caesar from all sides. Blood splattered across the marble floor, and the cries of the attackers mingled with the gasps of disbelief from those few senators not involved in the plot. Caesar, struggling to rise, fought to fend off his attackers, his body already weakening from the wounds. But it was when he saw Brutus among them, Brutus, whom he had loved as a son, that the final blow was struck, not to his body, but to his spirit. According to legend, Caesar's final words, spoken with a mixture of shock and sorrow, were, "Et tu, Brute? You too, Brutus?" In that moment, the betrayal was complete. Caesar, the man who had conquered Gaul, defeated Pompey, and ruled Rome, fell to the ground, his blood pooling around him. The Senate house fell silent. Caesar's lifeless body lay at the foot of the statue of Pompey, his former rival, as if fate had orchestrated the final irony. The conspirators, their hands stained with the blood of the dictator, stood in stunned silence. They had done what they set out to do, but as they looked upon the fallen figure of Caesar, the weight of their actions began to sink in. Outside, the streets of Rome bustled as always, unaware of the events unfolding within the Senate house. But soon the news would spread, and Rome would be plunged into chaos once again. The Republic had been saved, the conspirators believed, but in truth, they had only hastened its end. The death of Julius Caesar would not restore the Republic, but instead pave the way for an empire ruled by a single man. Chapter 8. The Aftermath and Caesar's Legacy. In the days following Julius Caesar's assassination, the streets of Rome were filled with uncertainty. Word of his death spread quickly, plunging the city into chaos. Crowds gathered in the Forum, their faces etched with fear and confusion. Many could scarcely believe it. The man who had reshaped Rome, who had triumphed in war and ruled as dictator, lay dead, struck down by the very senators who had once stood beside him. What had been meant as the salvation of the Republic now threatened to tear it apart. The conspirators, led by Brutus and Cassius, believed that with Caesar's death, the Republic would be restored. They had hoped that the Senate and the Roman people would see their actions as noble, an effort to preserve liberty and free Rome from the grip of tyranny. But the reality was far different. Instead of cheers and celebrations, they were met with hostility. The people mourned Caesar. He had been their champion, a man who had offered them hope and reforms in an era of political corruption. For all the Senate's talk of freedom, the common folk saw Caesar's murder as a betrayal. The immediate aftermath was marked by political paralysis. Rome, already fragile after years of civil war and upheaval, now stood at the brink of collapse. The senators who had supported the assassination fled the city, fearing reprisals. The city teetered on the edge of anarchy, with mobs clamoring for justice and demanding retribution for Caesar's death. Into this power vacuum stepped Caesar's most unexpected heir, Gaius Octavius, his grandnephew and adopted son, soon to be known as Augustus. Octavian, just 18 years old at the time of Caesar's death, was far from the seasoned political or military leader that Rome might have expected to rise in the wake of Caesar's assassination. Yet, he had been named as Caesar's heir in his will, a decision that took many by surprise. In the weeks and months that followed, Octavian would prove to be a masterful tactician. Despite his youth, he navigated the treacherous political landscape with a sharpness that belied his age, forging alliances with Caesar's former allies, including Mark Antony, and eventually avenging his adoptive father's death. The political chaos following Caesar's assassination quickly descended into yet another round of civil wars, as the forces loyal to Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus, the so-called Second Triumvirate, fought against those aligned with Brutus and Cassius. The conflict culminated in the decisive Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE, where the forces of the conspirators were crushed, and both Brutus and Cassius took their own lives. With the defeat of Caesar's assassins, the hope of reviving the Republic was buried with them. But even as Rome's republican institutions crumbled, Caesar's legacy began to take on a life of its own. He had left behind a city and an empire irrevocably changed. His reforms, especially the expansion of citizenship, the reorganization of the Senate, and the Julian calendar, would shape Roman life for centuries to come. His reformation of the army, including the loyalty of soldiers to their commanders rather than the state, set a precedent that would continue under future emperors. Militarily, his strategies and tactics, particularly his campaigns in Gaul, became models for future generals, not only in Rome but throughout Western history. Politically, Caesar's life and death marked the end of the Roman Republic and the birth of the Roman Empire. The Senate, once the heart of Roman governance, was reduced to a ceremonial body, a relic of a bygone era. In its place stood the power of the emperors, beginning with Octavian, who would later take the title Augustus and rule as the first Roman emperor. The system of government. Caesar had laid the foundations for an autocratic rule supported by popular favor and military might, became the model for centuries of Roman emperors to come. Yet, Caesar's legacy was far more complex than his role as the destroyer of the Republic. He was, after all, a reformer who had sought to address the deep social and economic inequalities of his time. His land reforms, debt relief programs, and public works projects were designed to uplift the common people, many of whom had been left destitute by years of political corruption and war. His embrace of the provinces and the inclusion of non-Italians into the Senate reflected his broader vision of Rome, not just as a city-state, but as a vast, multicultural empire. His relationship with power was equally complicated. Caesar was undeniably ambitious, and his accumulation of power alarmed the Senate. His acceptance of the title Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life, was seen by many as a step toward monarchy. Yet Caesar repeatedly refused the crown when it was offered to him, a gesture that suggested a desire to balance his ambition with the appearance of republican ideals. His assassination was, in many ways, the product of this tension, between the image of a ruler who sought to restore order and reform a broken system, and the fear that he intended to rule as a king. In the centuries that followed, Caesar's name became synonymous with power. In the Roman world, later emperors would invoke his legacy to legitimize their own rule, with the title Caesar becoming a permanent fixture of imperial titles. His name would endure far beyond Rome, giving rise to the German Kaiser and the Russian Tsar, both of which derived from Caesar's name. But Caesar's influence stretched even beyond governance and military strategy. He reshaped the very idea of leadership. His ability to inspire loyalty in his soldiers, his skill as a statesman, and his vision of empire left a profound mark on Western political thought. He embodied the paradox of the great man in history, both a reformer and a tyrant, a visionary leader who destroyed the very system he sought to save. As Octavian, soon to be Augustus, consolidated power and the Roman Empire began its rise to unprecedented heights, Caesar's shadow loomed over it all. His reforms, his conquests, and his life of ambition had reshaped the world. The Republic was gone, but in its place stood an empire that would last for centuries, its roots deeply entwined with the life of Julius Caesar. In the end, Caesar's legacy was one of transformation. He had changed the course of history for better or worse, leaving an indelible mark not only on Rome, but on the Western world. His life, filled with ambition, brilliance, and contradictions, continues to fascinate and inspire as the man who rose from the streets of Rome to reshape the destiny of an empire, and in doing so, changed the course of human history.